Hello, and welcome to my very first ASMR video. I've been a really big fan of the ASMR community since before anyone, including myself, I think, really understood what ASMR even really meant. And I've always been so inspired by the creators and impressed by what they've made with all their amazing content. I've been exclusively just a consumer of that content for a long time, but I always wanted to be someone who produced some content myself. I kept putting it off, and I never really knew what I wanted to do an actual video on. I wanted to do something a little bit different, if I could think of it, but it took me a long time to find something. But recently my father sent me a book called World War I British Poets. And as you might expect, it's a book full of poetry from the Great War, which I find particularly interesting. I actually teach history, and I'm really passionate about it. I'm extremely passionate about this point in history. On some occasions I've said I love World War I, but I think that's a very odd phrase to say because it's such a brutal, horrible time period. You don't really want to say you love that. I guess what I should say is I'm fascinated by it. I find it very interesting. So I thought this would be the perfect place to start. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read the excerpt about them, about the author. I have two authors I'm going to be reading from today. And before I read their poetry, there's a little bit of an excerpt from them to describe who they are, what they did. And what's particularly interesting about the two authors that I have is as you go through the book, you'll look at some of the authors. Rupert Brooke, 1887 to 1915. Charles Hamilton Sorley, 1895 to 1915. Edward Thomas, 1878 to 1917. Isaac Rosenberg, 1890 to 1918. John McCrae, 1872 to 1918. You might be noticing a pattern here, and that is that all of these died during the war, presumably from the war, I would imagine. I don't think that they had a freak accident while the war was going on. But the two authors I'll be reading from are actually ones who survived the war. The first one is Siegfried Sassoon. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name right, if it's Sassoon or Sassoon, but he lived from 1886 to 1967, so he made it all the way to the 60s. Here's what the book has to say about him. The war poems of Siegfried Sassoon are biting satires condemning the war, describing such poems as The One-Legged Man as satirical drawings. Sassoon acknowledged that he intended to disturb complacency with his art. Sassoon himself served valiantly in the war's early years and was awarded the Military Cross for bravery. But as the war continued, Sassoon came to the conclusion that it was being needlessly prolonged. In the summer of 1917, he submitted his now famous protest against the war to his commanding officer, which was reprinted in the press. In it, Sassoon declared that he had entered the war believing it was one of defense and liberation, but he now saw it as a war of aggression and conquest. He could no longer be party to prolong the sufferings for which he believed were evil and unjust. Incendiary as Sassoon's statement was, its impact was lessened by the efforts of his friend and fellow poet, Robert Graves, who used his influence to protect Sassoon. Rather than having to face a court-martial, Sassoon was tried by a medical board and judged to be suffering from severe shell shock. Sassoon's account of the investigation appears in the autobiographical Memoirs of an Infantry Officer, which was written in 1931. After the medical board's ruling, Sassoon was sent to Craig Lockhart Military Hospital, where he met Wilfred Owen, and while there composed some of his finest war poems. Sassoon published his first volume of war poetry, The Old Huntsman, in May 1917, and a second volume, Counterattack, in July 1918. Perhaps the greatest irony of Sassoon's poetry was its popular success. As Bernard Bergonzi observes, Sassoon's anti-war outcry had been transformed into a subtler form of war propaganda, and some of the very people he condemned, politicians and civilians alike, celebrated his verse. I find that very interesting. He says that he went into the war initially believing it to be one of defense and liberation, but then believed that it was aggression and conquest. Because that's debatable, of course, but fairly accurate to a lot of how the war was carried out. Now, his poetry is interesting because it's almost a little humorous. I find it hard to laugh at it, but it certainly has a form of very dark humor in there. Let's start, for example, with they. The bishop tells us, when the boys come back, they will not be the same, for they'll have fought. In a just cause they led the last attack. On Antichrist their comrades' blood has bought. New right to breed an honorable race. They have challenged death and dared him face to face. We're none of us the same, the boys reply, for George lost both his legs and Bill's stone blind. Poor Jim's shot through the lungs and likely to die, and Bert's gone syphilitic. You'll not find a chap who served that hasn't found some change. And the bishop said, the ways of God are strange. I think this really speaks to the idea of people who are in a safe position and very gung-ho about marching off to war without any kind of threat to their own life. I don't mean this to be any kind of anti-religious or Christianity message here. So if you are a follower of that, I don't mean this as an attack of any kind, but this bishop here, presumably he does not have any children, as you might imagine a bishop would probably not have. And, he's very, very supportive of this idea of let's go off to war, and the boys will go off to war and they'll come back changed. And he means changed in a good way. He means they'll be more strong, they'll be more courageous, because they'll have gone off to fight the Antichrist, as he calls it. My apologies to any German viewers who might be listening. But when the boys do come back, they say, yeah, we have come back and we have changed. But here's how we've changed. He lost both his legs. He's blind. He's been shot through the lungs. Right? We've all been changed. And the bishop, he's just kind of very dismissive. Instead of saying that he's wrong or anything like that, he just says, well, the ways of God are strange. He has the answers when he wants to send them off to war, but he doesn't quite have the answers when they ask him about what happened to them. A good example, I think, of sort of the dark humor. It's in the right mood, it's a little funny almost, but at the same time, it's also pretty depressing. Here's another one. The one-legged man. Propped on a stick, he viewed the august weald. Squat orchard trees and oaks with painted cowls. A homely, tangled hedge of a corn-stooked field, with sound of barking dogs and farmyard fowls. And he'd come home again to find it more desirable than ever it was before. How right it seemed that he should reach the span of comfortable years allowed to a man, splendid to eat and sleep and choose a wife, safe with his wound, a citizen of life. He hobbled blithely through the garden gate, and thought, thank God they had to amputate. So here we see another story, sort of told with a dark humor here. You think of the idea of someone going off to war and losing their leg is horrible, but in this case he's very happy that happened because he got to live. He got to live, basically. He believes he would have died. He says, thank God I may have still been in the trenches, right? I still may have been fighting. I may have died, but instead I lost my leg. I get to go home. I get to live with my life, or live with my wife, rather. I think that shows that by that point in the war, the soldiers didn't view it as a righteous cause of any kind. They really just looked at it in the sense of what it could do to them and how they could get out of it. Now, this next author we're going to be reading from, Ivor Gurney. I remember when I first was reading through the book, his name comes up a little bit later, and he was the first one I saw that had survived the war. And I was very happy because I thought, well, that's a happy ending for him at least. Although he didn't survive the war by very long. He was born in 1890, and he died in 1937. Here's what the book has to say about him. Ivor Gurney was born in Gloucester to a lower middle-class professional family. Early on, he showed musical talent, and with the help of a local patron, was awarded a scholarship to the Royal College of Music. When the war broke out, Gurney enlisted, but was turned down because of his poor eyesight. He was accepted when he enlisted again in 1915, and was sent to France in 1916. Gurney was acutely sensitive to the horrors of war, and after being wounded in April and gassed in August of 1917, he was sent to a mental hospital. Gurney's mental health had always been precarious, and his war experiences exacerbated his condition. Though there were periods of recovery from the paranoid schizophrenia from which he suffered, Gurney was finally confined to a mental home in Gloucester in 1922, and later to the City of London Mental Hospital in Kent, where he remained until his death in 1937. During his lifetime, Gurney achieved a modest fame as a composer, his music heavily influenced by poetry. He created song cycles to the works of A. E. Housman and that of his fellow war poet Edward Thomas, who also appears in this book, as well as to the poems of John Clare, the 19th century poet whose verse Gurney set to music while confined in the mental asylum. Gerard Manley Hopkins provided another poetic inspiration for Gurney, and in his poems as well as music, one can trace the same tensions of melancholy and despair that characterize much of Hopkins' poetry. Melancholy and despair is definitely how I would describe this author's life and his works. This isn't going to be the dark humor that we saw in the last one. And I wish I had looked up some of his music, because I find his poems to be really quite wonderful. We're only going to read one of his, though. This poem is called The Target. I shot him, it had to be. One of us, 'twas him or me. Couldn't be helped, and none can blame. Me for you would do the same. My mother, she can't sleep for fear of what might be a happening here to me. Perhaps it might be best to die and set her fears to rest. For worst is worst, and worry's done. Perhaps he was the only son. Yet God keeps still and does not say a word of guidance anyway. Well, if they get me, first I'll find that boy and tell him all my mind, and see who felt the bullet worst, and ask his pardon if I durst. All's a tangle, here's my job. A man might rave or shout or sob, and God, he takes no sort of heed. This is a bloody mess indeed. I think we see a really good example here of a soldier, a reluctant soldier, someone who, well, I suppose reluctant soldier might not be the best term for him since he did choose to enlist, but maybe he enlisted and realized the horrors of the war as it went on. Unfortunately, it does not say the year that the poem was written. I wish it did, because I would like to know how late in the war it was. But I think it shows the idea that in a lot of wars, I know this is very common in the American Civil War as well, the idea that they may be your enemy and you may be required to shoot them, but you don't necessarily have any ill will or malice towards the person you're killing. As he says, 'twas him or me. But then he goes on to think about how if he goes up to heaven, he'll meet the enemy soldier and they'll have a conversation. He'll ask his forgiveness. Sad stuff. I think I'm going to stop here. I might come back at some point and do another video on some of the other poems if this is something that people seem to like. This video overall is just me doing a couple things. One, I'm trying to just dip my feet into the community as a creator for the first time. I actually had a conversation with one of my favorite ASMR creators, actually. And I remember I asked her, how did you get started? What was the spark that initiated it? And she said, you just have to jump in and do it. So I'm glad she gave me that advice, although I think it did take me about a year to finally follow it. Anyways, I hope you guys liked the video. If you have any suggestions, I would love to hear them. Anything I can do to improve what I'm working on is always welcome. Thank you very much, and have a good night.